Great. So thanks again for attending today's training on precinct boundaries. We will be making these slides and this recording available on our website shortly after today's session. So here's our agenda. We will talk through what precinct boundaries are, why they matter in redistricting, how they actually get used in some of these court cases, why collecting them is so difficult, and there are many reasons for that. And then how you can help in our volunteer data collection effort to support those states likely to be engaging in mid-decade redistricting. And as I've said, we'll have time for questions at the end. So precincts are the smallest geographic unit at which election results are collected and reported by election officials. Very unfortunately, there is not standard terminology around precincts. So depending on where you are, folks might call them different things. For example, if you live in Wisconsin, they call them wards. I've heard them be referred to as election districts or EDs if you live in New York State. There's also groups and entities that will call these precincts voting districts or voting tabulation districts or VTDs. Precinct is the most common name for it, but as I said, unfortunately, there are some synonyms that you may encounter when thinking about this kind of data. And when I say geographic unit, other examples of geographic units are like states or counties or cities, right? These are all geographic boundaries that you can go and download from the Census Bureau, and then you can look at data by these geographic units, right? So what is the total population by state or by county? Well, elections are run by states, and they have essentially delegated a lot of the task of running elections to counties. So precincts and precinct boundaries, the term that we use to refer to the data set containing this data, are also maintained by counties. And when I say like this, the data, it's literally enabling you to see where the boundaries are in space, are on a map. So you could load it into mapping software and see these are the precinct boundaries in this particular county. And then also, what do I mean by maintain, right? Like, well, counties maintain these boundaries. Well, I mean that county officials decide where the boundaries go. They create a map of the boundaries, and then they update the boundaries and the maps over time. And as I've alluded to at the outset, frequently, once we obtain these boundaries, we are interested in joining them with these precinct level election results, enabling folks like you and others to draw and analyze redistricting plans. So it's always helpful to see sort of a visual of this. These are the precincts that were in effect in Monroe County, New York, during the 2020 general election. Monroe County has a population of about 740,000 people or so, at least as of the 2020 census. And the county itself is outlined in black here. The precincts are in purple. And you can see that sort of generally there's more precincts where there are more people. So Rochester, it's hard to see, but it's under this cluster of many, many purple precincts here. And that's where most people in Monroe County reside. Also, other towns like Brockport over here. They also tend to follow geographic features at times. So you can see this is Irondequoit Bay, and you can see that there's a line that sort of follows this, or the river here, or even some roads. A lot of these sort of straight lines are following roads here. But otherwise, it's pretty haphazard, right? It's pretty random. And this is not shown on this map because it would be too crowded, but each precinct also has a name or a unique identifier. And so when our data partners go out and collect precinct level election data, they get a spreadsheet that contains, for each precinct, the breakdown of votes for every candidate. So, the 2020 presidential candidates, for example. And this is what we mean by precinct level election results, that the election results are reported by precinct. And they should have as many rows in their spreadsheet of election data as there are precincts in this map. And when we join the two of them together, we will use that precinct name or precinct identifier to do so. Okay, so I've already said you need precinct boundaries to analyze maps, but how does that exactly work? Well, you definitely need them if you want to identify racial gerrymandering in litigation. There is a common analysis conducted to identify racial gerrymandering under the Voting Rights Act called a racially polarized voting analysis, or RPV. RPV is a bit complicated, but in brief, it requires determining whether a protected minority group, whether that be a racial, ethnic, or language minority group, vote cohesively, sort of vote together as a whole. And then the majority group, again, whether that's race or ethnicity or language, but that majority group is also voting together as a whole. And the majority group's preferred candidates are regularly defeating the minority group's preferred candidates. Okay. And if you want to do that analysis, then you need precinct boundaries. Similarly, some of the most sophisticated emerging methodologies that identify not only racial, but also partisan gerrymandering require this data as well. So don't worry if this particular slide goes over your head. This is a training about precinct boundaries and not these complicated methodologies that use the precinct boundaries, but it is, I think, very nice and illustrative to see what this actually looks like in the end. And in short, what this involves is creating an algorithm that's going to draw thousands of hypothetical redistricting maps. And when political scientists and computer scientists create these algorithms, they can essentially require that these districts meet certain requirements. So you can say, I want to draw in this state 6 districts. I want these 6 districts to have equal population, within some sort of range. I want them to be contiguous. I can sort of trace them with my finger and or a pencil, and I never have to lift up my finger or pencil to trace the rest of the district. Okay, and other things. And then press go, and then the algorithm will produce thousands and thousands of hypothetical possible maps. And for each of these individual maps, you calculate some value of interest. Say it's the 2-party vote margin in these districts based on 2020 election data, which is what is plotted here on this y-axis. And then you can actually compare what the actual enacted map looked like compared to all of these hypothetical maps. So this is a graph of the outcomes of simulated districts in a state with 6 districts, as I said, and basically each of these dots that you see, the red or blue dots, is the outcome of one hypothetical map. And then for each district, they looked and saw if the Republican won, and then made it a red dot. If the Democrat won, it was a blue dot. And then they're going to plot all of those, as I said, thousands and thousands of hypothetical maps. And then the dark bar here is where the actual enacted map falls. And you can tell sort of like where the more common outcomes are because they're shaded darker. So District 2 is a good example to look at, where you can see that most of the time in these hypothetical maps, the Republican is winning, not necessarily by a lot, but the vast majority of those hypothetical maps are producing a situation where District 2, a Republican is winning, but in the enacted map, actually a Democrat won. And then you can see that similarly for these other districts as well. So if you stuck with me through that, great work and pretty cool, right? This is the kind of research that Precinct Boundaries enables, and as we've seen, ultimately used in court to identify both partisan and racial gerrymanders. Analysis of maps during the redistricting process or after the fact in litigation is a common use of this data set, but there are others. Of course, the academics who are creating these algorithms use it for their research, as well as other related efforts. Individual members of the public use it to participate in the redistricting process in their state, and journalists use it to explain redistricting and gerrymandering to the public. And there are many examples I could give you, but a few of my favorite in particular come from a series of articles in The Guardian by Sam Levine, where he and his co-authors looked at the impact of redistricting in a number of states. This particular one that I'm showing you here is Tennessee, and how the Democratic district surrounding Nashville was going to be divided into 3 Republican-leaning districts. So the districts here are outlined in black. They were proposed at the time, eventually enacted. You can also kind of see faintly the county lines in gray in the background there. But more vivid are the red and the blue bubbles here, which represent whether that precinct reports more Republican or Democratic votes in 2020, respectively. And then the size of the bubble is also proportional to the size of the number of votes cast. So you can sort of see where the counties and the precincts with more people are compared to the smaller dots where there's fewer people casting votes. And so again, you need not only the precinct level election results, but also the precinct boundaries to generate this image. So we understand what precinct boundaries are. We get why they're important. Now let's talk about why they are so difficult to get a hold of. And I've already alluded to really one of the main problems that we encounter here. And that is that precincts are maintained by counties and county equivalents if you live in Alaska or Louisiana or any of those other states. But so, you know, in any of these states, you have to go county by county to collect the precinct boundaries and the precinct level election results in some cases. There are over 3,100 county and county equivalents in the US. And so each time you're having to go to the website, you're having to figure out who to contact, you're having to reach out to them by email, by phone, sometimes both. And then you have to confirm a lot of information, right? Is this actually the map that was in effect for this election? And because the data that we host is used by some of these groups in litigation, there's also some other information that we request while we're there so that we're just really confident in the quality of the data. But of course, that takes time. Not only that, the precinct boundaries aren't static. Election administrators can change them as often as they want, certainly from 2020 to 2022 to 2024, but even from a primary to a general election. And Michael, I see you have a great question in the chat that I am going to get to in a few slides. And if I don't answer it well enough, then please revisit this question. So they can be changing them from every election. There can also be odd year elections, right? You've got local elections, school board elections. We love elections in the US and we like to have them all the time. And these can all have different sets of precinct boundaries. And so, okay, you're thinking maybe fine, they're changing them often, but let's just wait. You know, let's just wait until after 2026 and we can get the 2022 and the 2024 and the 2026 and any other precinct boundaries they've used for elections in the meantime. Well, unfortunately, counties don't have to hold on to historical precinct boundaries, right? It's almost like a candy bar that you get. You delightfully eat the candy, but you throw the wrapper away, right? You don't need that. Well, the wrapper is the precinct boundaries for us, and we really, really want those. And from their perspective, there's may not really be much of a reason to keep those boundaries around, right? They're focused on running elections, not doing complicated analyses over time. So they just save over the old file or throw away the old map when they update the boundaries. And the longer that you wait to collect them, the more likely it is to for them to have gotten rid of those old historical boundaries. So as a function of being maintained by 3,100 plus counties, every county has their own way of formatting the data and sort of their own file type. If you've ever worked with election results or voter file data before, you probably got a CSV or an Excel sheet, or even perhaps a text file, a TXT, right? These are all kinds of file formats for that kind of data, for tabular data. But here we've got geospatial data that we want to actually import into some mapping software and see, as I said, where the boundaries are in space. And so there's a few common options for file formats that enable that. Probably the most common are what are called shape files. And those are actually a series of 4 or more files in a folder. To make it confusing, one of the files is actually specifically a shapefile, but we just refer to all of these files, the 4 or more files in a folder, as shapefiles. And then that folder is usually zipped. You may also encounter like a JSON or a GeoJSON. A geodatabase is also a format that we've stumbled across. And then there's a few others as well. That is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. It's also common to encounter non-geospatial formats of the data, such as a PDF or even just like a picture taken of a physical map that's hanging up in the county office. Some counties are small and they just have one person doing a lot of different jobs. This could also be just a low resource county and they don't have GIS capabilities. They might not have the time, right? There's lots and lots of reasons why a county might not be able to provide a geospatial version of the precinct boundaries. So we take what we can get. I just want to flag too that this image on the slide here is a screenshot from North Carolina, which is an exceptional ideal. I don't want you to walk away thinking that this is how all states are. In fact, this is sort of the opposite of the point I'm trying to make. North Carolina, you can go to their website and they have actually a statewide precinct boundary file. They also, as you can see, have it in shapefile format. So that's why these are all zip files here. And then they also keep all their historical boundaries and they date them neatly so that you know what election they are in effect for. Again, this is not the rule, this is the exception. But this is ultimately what we're hoping folks have, right? Is shapefiles or some other geospatial format. A much more common situation that you'll see than North Carolina is a state like Ohio. This graphic was put together by one of our data partners, the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, or MGGG, out of Tufts University after a collection effort they engaged in 2018. They compiled this map based on the data and the formats of the data that they received from each county. And the main takeaway here is just the sheer variety of formats and styles in which the data comes in, right? There's geospatial, there's non-geospatial. Looks like they were in progress here. There's some empty counties, right? Here's one where they actually received separate images. I've seen this as well, where each precinct is its own PDF. And that may be very useful for some context, but that's certainly not a useful scenario for us. So there's gonna be a lot of processing to get from a place that looks like this to the North Carolina situation where we have a nice statewide geospatial precinct boundary file. Okay, so just getting the maps from every county and county equivalent is certainly one problem. And then processing and creating a statewide file is another. And that requires a lot of technical skill. So when we get non-geospatial formats like PDFs, they need to be what's called digitized. And they're basically like converted from a physical version into a geospatial version that can be used in mapping software. So this is almost always going to be less precise, this digitization process, than if we just got shapefiles or some other geospatial format out of the gate. If you get a small map, for example, you know, it's not very high resolution, and it's got very thick lines drawn on it. In some cases, these are, as I said, physical maps that folks will draw on with a colored pencil or marker or something, and then take a photo of it. And so, you know, if a precinct boundary is going along a street, like I was showing you in the example of Monroe County, is everybody on that street in one precinct, or are they all in this other precinct? Or does the boundary go literally right down the middle of the street and people that live on one side of the street are in one precinct and people that live on the other side of the street are in the other precinct? Sometimes that can be really difficult to tell with these low resolution, sort of grainy PDFs. So unfortunately, it does lend itself to less precision and, of course, more work, which are both good reasons why we vastly prefer geospatial versions of the data. Great, so we've done all this hard work. Now we just got to all combine it into a single statewide file by joining them. Sadly, this is not what the actual process looks like. It's just a bunch of lines of code in Python. But this is a nice visualization of the process. So imagine that we collected precinct data from Orange County, New York, and then we went and got Sullivan County precinct boundaries, and then we got Ulster County precinct boundaries, and ultimately we want to join them all, and we're going to continue collecting and joining throughout the state until we have a precinct boundary map that fills out the whole state of New York. But even here, there are some weird issues that happen. For example, as I've said, all the counties are responsible for maintaining their own precinct boundaries in their counties. And so you'll get a county map, you know, let's say Orange County, and you get Sullivan County, And when you go to join them, the county lines don't actually perfectly line up with one another. And you end up with a precinct from one county sort of overlapping with a precinct of another county. Well, it's not actually what happened on the ground. That's not how the election was actually administered, but this is just a function of the data quality. And so that's something that, you know, we have to fix. Basically, we have to go and sort of manually identify where these boundaries are overlapping, just because of the quality of the data that we're getting, and sort of de-duplicate or un-overlap them, whatever you might call that. So I'm not totally up to date on the chat here, but I am circling back to the great question about voting tabulation districts or VTDs. And why can't we use this data? Because absolutely, that is a very common thing. People go searching and they, you know, see, hey, like, look, the Census Bureau just has all this data. Why, you know, why are you guys bothering to go county by county? Well, the Census Bureau is aware that, you know, census data is used heavily for redistricting, and they try to release data that is helpful for that process. And so they realize that when drawing redistricting plans, that sometimes folks might want data at the precinct level. So they've got all the other geographic units that I mentioned before, states, counties, census tracts, right, so on and so forth. But precincts are maintained by the counties. And so they started coordinating with states, trying to basically get a hold of these boundaries so that they could, in fact, release census data at this VTD level. Well, it's a voluntary program. Some states participate, some do not. Some provide really great data, some less so. Some counties change their elections, their precincts, the very next election anyway. So the data is immediately out of date. So VTDs can be good approximations of precincts in some places, but not all. And they're increasingly out of date the further away you get from when the Bureau collected them. I also want to flag, and if you don't live in Texas, you can just ignore this. But if you do live in Texas and you're looking around at Texas's data, you go, wait, Texas has precincts and VTDs. We actually like to call these Texas VTDs, like one hyphenated word, to make clear that we're not talking about the Census Bureau VTDs. You can ask me in the Q&A portion, like what the heck's going on with there, but Texas is the only state I am aware of that sort of maintains two separate boundaries at which they sort of release data at. So they have their Texas precincts and their Texas VTDs. Now, some states, as you've already seen with North Carolina, do collect precinct boundaries from the counties and create a statewide file. As you can see here, in just a few of these states, they also join them with their election results. That would include like Texas and Wisconsin, but also, as I mentioned, North Carolina has statewide precinct boundary files, Georgia, Louisiana, and there are others. This is not an exhaustive list. This is fantastic. This saves everyone a ton of time. But again, these states are the exception, not the rule. So how can you help? Well, the best way is to join our volunteer effort. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat once again. If you've attended this training, which you are, if you're listening to me this right now, you can just go ahead and fill this out. I will then share with you some additional training documentation, and we'll get started pretty quickly here. I want to take this opportunity to highlight in particular our recent experience working with some just fabulous volunteers in Ohio. I now know that Ohio has 88 counties, and they went and contacted every single county in Ohio to obtain the most recent set of precinct boundaries. We are anticipating redistricting happening again soon in that state, which is why it was a high priority for us. And now that we've wrapped up our collection, our team is working on digitizing and joining and doing all that work I was just talking about to get that statewide file up on the website. And we're very, very eager to start on the next state. We'll figure out exactly which state based on sort of updates, right? Today was a big update in terms of redistricting timelines, also volunteer interest in terms of the states that folks are interested in collecting in. So as I said, we will figure that out shortly, but you can see in the volunteer interest form which states we are looking at most likely to be collecting in next. Again, this effort in Ohio was just really impressive. We had fewer than 10 volunteers, and they estimate it took about 2 to 3 hours per county to do all the things that we are asking them to do, to track down the people in these counties, to contact them again when they were ignored, or not ignored, but just again, county officials do receive a lot of requests, right? So this does require some persistence to stay on top of things. So 88 counties times 2.5 hours divided unevenly by 10 volunteers, and you can do the math, but the important point here is that many hands make light work. And these volunteers were also pleasantly surprised, as was I, by how many counties did have shapefiles, and also how many had indicated there had been no changes since 2020. We're going through and validating all of that. But if so, that means definitely less work than in 2022. So that's the thing, though, is every state is different, is super different. And we just don't know what we're going to encounter in the next state. It could have lots of counties without shapefiles, shapefiles with precincts that have changed many, many times since 2020. So we just won't know until we start digging into that particular state. But the good news is our guidance has been through the ringer now. We've made some real small improvements and updates to the process. And so we're really excited to get going on the next state because there's no shortage of needs for these precinct boundaries. So just to give you a better picture of sort of what this process involves, I've been talking about it sort of obliquely, but very, very directly here. Essentially you would have to go find this, the county's website, right? So we have a list of all the counties, but we don't have, URLs or websites for the counties. So, tracking down the county, looking around to see if they have a map. Not only is every state different, but every county is different. And so, some counties, everything you need is right there on the election page, right? Other folks, they have just a clerk who does a lot of things, including elections. And so maybe that's where you end up. Other places have, GIS capabilities, and they have maybe the whole GIS office. Sometimes they have like an assessor or an auditor or somebody like that who also happens to just have GIS capabilities. And so they might have a geospatial file of precinct boundaries, even though they're not responsible for them, right? So it's just, there's a lot of sort of sleuthing involved here and figuring out who is the right person to talk to and who can help me out with this request. We do have scripts for contacting folks for both email and phone to try to make it easy. I have used these scripts myself, so I think they're pretty good, although we do always encourage folks to personalize them to make them feel comfortable with exactly how things are being phrased. As I said, being persistent, following up on the request, and then looking at the map that you eventually get and checking, like, is this reasonable, right? First of all, is it county-wide? Is it missing anything, right? Maybe there's a very large city in that county, and that city actually has their own precinct boundaries. And so you would have to go out and contact somebody at that city or municipality as well, right? Or, is there just something weird or off about it, right? So just looking to see, like, yes, these do look and smell like precinct boundaries. And then also, as I said, because ultimately we're interested in joining the precinct boundaries with these election results, and we need that unique identifier to do that. And so also looking to see what are the names that the county is giving these precincts in the precinct boundary file, and do they match the names in the precinct level election results? You might be surprised, or maybe not, of how often those things don't match. Sometimes they're in the ballpark, right? And, it's precinct 1 over here, and it's 1 over here, and precinct 2 and 2. And so you can kind of make some educated guesses, but we don't really feel comfortable doing that very often. And so just really want to be super clear exactly, when we're looking at these election results and you're saying this is the vote breakdown for this precinct, are you talking about this precinct in space? And then recording all of this, recording all of your interactions, all the supporting information, because as I said, these files do end up in litigation. So we want to be very confident of their quality, and we want to be able to demonstrate what's called the chain of custody. How did the file get from the county official to eventually this person's analysis? So our volunteer collection effort is, we believe, one of the most impactful things that you can do right now to help fight gerrymandering in 2023 and beyond. I do want to flag a few other sort of opportunities or things to reflect on or to be on the lookout for related to precinct boundaries. One is that we just recently announced that we are hiring for some data fellows who are going to be helping us with some of this work, because it is a big task. I will put that link in the chat as well. If you are curious, please check that out. Or if you know folks who you think might be interested in applying for that fellowship, please go ahead and share that with them. We are also engaged in or supporting other efforts to address this problem on sort of a longer term, bigger scale. And one of the most promising, I think, is an effort to pass state level voting rights acts. So fortunately, we still have Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And increasingly, we see states adopting state level voting rights act that essentially mimic a lot of the information that is in the federal, or a lot of the protections that is in the Federal Voting Rights Act. So California's had one for a bit, Virginia, New York recently passed one. Washington has a state level voting rights act as well. And these bills, at least in California and New York and the other pending states where they're looking at this legislation, Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, there may be others. I don't want to say that those are the only ones, but those are the three that I'm aware of at least, includes a database provision. And the database provision essentially requires the state to collect all the data from counties, election results data, precinct boundary data, other data that is useful and helpful for the public to engage in redistricting and other election related work, and collect all of that and then make it publicly available at the state level. This would be huge if more states did this. It still doesn't solve the immediate problem, right? Even a place like New York, which is considering this legislation, even if they pass that bill, it's not going to be up and running in time for 2022 data to be available when we need it. But it certainly solves the problem for future elections, because as you've gathered, every time there's election, we have to go out and collect those precinct boundaries. So you can look out for the groups that are moving these bills. Again, I don't want to say this is an exhaustive list, but I know that NAACP LDF, as well as Campaign Legal Center out of Harvard, are both involved in efforts to get state level Voting Rights Act passed. So I encourage you to look into those organizations and some of the work that they're doing around those bills. A second effort that I want you to be aware of is a series of state reports that we recently completed in 14 states in particular, looking at the accessibility and quality of all the data sets that you need for redistricting. By now, you all know that, of course, that involves precinct boundaries. So please check out other reports on our website, and you can see where your state fares, not only in terms of precinct boundaries, but also, some of those other data sets I mentioned, election results, voter file data. There's lots and lots of data that gets involved in redistricting. And you might be shocked by some of what you find in those reports. And if your state isn't one of those 14, we would love to expand this down the line. It's not on our radar at this moment, but at a minimum, email us if you're looking for data in your state and you're not finding it, right? That's something that we will gladly help out with. So I know some of you have questions. I've already been seeing some questions in the chat. Please go ahead and add them in the chat if you haven't already. You can also raise your hand, come off mute and speak. You can also privately message John or myself with a question as well. And if you think of a question later this evening or tomorrow or next week, you can always email us and our help desk at info@redistrictingdatahub.org.